5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, just read this. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and all others physically present in this room, per recent guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's proceeding, except when a member is speaking at the microphone. Please also sanitize your seating area. The chair views these measures as a safety issue, therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRS 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for remarks. Where are we here? Right here. Right here.
Yeah,
No,
that's
right.
the, you want
Yeah. I want you to know that I shortened it for you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your patience. Due to this afternoon's votes, I want to be sure that my colleagues can ask questions, so I will make just a few remarks and submit my full statement for the record. In March and April, my home state of New Jersey was among the places hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic. While I worked to help secure personal protection equipment for our hospitals and ensure the message of our public health experts were reaching my constituents, as chairman of the subcommittee, I also continued to watch closely what was happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the face of this pandemic, which has caused so much suffering in this country and throughout our hemisphere, I have been reminded of how interconnected we are. The pandemic has demonstrated that the security of our neighbors has direct implication for us. My message today is that we are all in this together. For that reason, I have deep concerns about President Trump's response to the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean. This pandemic has laid bare the cost of President Trump's approach on going it alone in our foreign policy. In April, President Trump froze funding for the Pan American Health Organization, which was doing life-saving work in Venezuela. This is the same organization that had worked closely with USAID a year earlier to reduce measles cases in Venezuela by over 90%. The president decided that making a political point was more important than saving lives. I know that the cuts he imposed last year to our foreign assistance programs in the Northern Triangle are still undermining our ability to reduce poverty and food insecurity in the region. Nonetheless, I have called this hearing because we know that this pandemic is not going away anytime soon. I am grateful to Ambassador Cossack and Mr. Hodges for testifying. I know they are here representing thousands of hardworking public servants in the State Department and USAID. I want to take note of those individuals who worked to repatriate thousands of Americans at the beginning of the pandemic, including dozens of my constituents. We are deeply grateful for your service. My message to the Trump administration is to let us work with you, Democrats and Republicans, to support this region in stemming the spread of the coronavirus. I urge the administration to re-engage with Congress and return to the normal practice of regularly briefing members and staff, including on shared priorities like the crisis in Venezuela. In the coming months, we must work shoulder to shoulder with countries in the region to address both immediate health impacts and secondary effects of the pandemic. I will always advocate for stronger engagement in our hemisphere, and I look forward to working with the administration and my colleagues to ensure that Latin American and the Caribbean are prioritized in our foreign assistance and diplomatic response. Thank you, and I now turn to Ranking Member Rooney for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Sears, for organizing this hearing on these. Thank you to our witnesses. According to the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, there are over 9. I can't tell if it's working or not. Working?
You're working. Get closer to the mic.
Is it working okay now? I'm technologically challenged.
You and I both.
There are over 9.1 million COVID-19 cases in the world and responsible for over 470,000 deaths. The Western Hemisphere was impacted early, and as the cases began to arise in the United States, we also saw the disease ravage Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. Today, we're seeing alarming spikes in Mexico and Brazil. Brazil alone has over 1.1 million cases, and as winter arrives in South America, the region enters flu season, which may make things deteriorate further. Many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are facing challenges in the response to the pandemic, which is overburdening their fragile healthcare systems. One example is Haiti, which is preparing for an increase in COVID-19 amid serious economic challenges, political crises, rampant urban violence, and they still really haven't recovered from the earthquakes. In addition to these challenges, the countries are struggling to combat disinformation and a lack of public health education on preventative measures. True to their authoritarian nature, the regimes of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are using the pandemic to maintain their stranglehold on power, manipulate their people, and further oppress their citizens. The Castro regime in Cuba continues to exploit the pandemic for political and financial gain by trafficking their doctors as part of the misleading medical diplomacy campaign. The Ortega regime has refused outright to acknowledge the true impact of the disease, while reports of express burials under cover of darkness are exposing their horrible lack of transparency. Lastly, the disease threatens to overwhelm Venezuela's already depleted health system and exacerbate the country's ongoing social and political instability. Sadly, the Maduro regime continues to show that it cares more about its hold on power than it does about the well-being of the Venezuelan people. Despite these challenges, the United States has stepped up as the single largest donor to the international COVID-19 response, providing over $82 million in foreign assistance to at least 24 countries in the Western Hemisphere to support their pandemic response and recovery. This health assistance includes support for water, sanitation, and hygiene, risk communication and community engagement, and infection prevention, control, and rapid response. It targets assistance to vulnerable populations like refugees, migrants, and their host communities. Lastly, we have seen the United States provide ventilators to countries in the region, which we know are critical in saving lives. U.S. leadership during this pandemic is critical. The emergency assistance we are providing to our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere demonstrates our commitment to our region's well-being and builds upon our long-term investment in our hemispheric prosperity. As we continue to face immense challenges presented by the pandemic, it's an opportunity for the international community to come together, and I applaud the efforts made so far. Nonetheless, there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the virus and the future impact in the region. The United States needs a strategy for how it will respond, and not only to the immediate health impact of the pandemic, but also to the secondary impacts of the crisis on delayed elections in Bolivia, the growing influence of adversaries like Iran and Venezuela, the exploitation of the crisis by transnational criminal organizations. And by the way, thank you, Chairman, for holding that hearing on banned print here a while back, and increased food insecurity, as well as the continual malign influence of China. I look forward to the testimonies of our witnesses and the many questions that will be raised. And thank you, Chairman Cerez, for hosting this important hearing. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Rooney. Nice to see you, even if it's on the screen.
Right.
I will now
Nice to
introduce
see you.
the Honorable Michael Kosak, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs. As a charter member of the Korea Executive Service, Ambassador Kosak has held many senior positions, including as Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. He has also held the role of Senior Director of the National Security Council staff and served as the United States Ambassador to Belarus and the Chief of Missions in Cuba. Ambassador Kosak, we welcome you and thank you for your patience.
Well, Chairman Saris, Ranking Member Rooney, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it truly is an honor to be asked to discuss our response to the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean. And to see you again, sir. This is a very welcome place to be. Latin America is currently experiencing the highest number of daily reported COVID deaths in the world. Chile, Brazil, Peru, and Mexico report the region's highest infection rates. The pandemic has gravely affected all of the region's economies. The U.S. government mounted a robust response to the COVID pandemic in the region. Our attention first turned to U.S. citizens overseas. The department mounted the largest repatriation effort in its history. As of June 16, the State Department Repatriation Task Force has facilitated the return of more than 64,000 U.S. citizens from Latin America and the Caribbean. I should say that's about 2/3 of what we've done worldwide has been in our region. The United States also stepped up to support the region through foreign assistance. My colleague, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean, Josh Hodges, will go into the details, but the State Department and USAID have provided nearly $120 million in COVID supplemental and humanitarian assistance response in Latin America and the Caribbean. Additionally, using humanitarian assistance funding from the U.S. Southern Command and the Department of Defense, security cooperation officers implemented 183 COVID-related humanitarian assistance projects in 26 countries. These initial projects added up to more than $10 million in rapidly delivered support in the form of PPE, cleaning equipment, hand sanitizer, and field hospital tents. Thanks to the support of the American manufacturing base, we have delivered on President Trump's commitment to meet the ventilator needs of many foreign governments once the projected needs of the U.S. had been met. We have donated 950 ventilators to countries in the region, and we are currently processing 2,000 more. To date, the recipient countries include Colombia, Brazil, El Salvador, Honduras, and Peru. The U.S. government has also facilitated the commercial procurement of U.S. manufactured ventilators by countries in the region. The U.S. has supported flexible and rapid financing packages to countries in the region through international financial institutions to aid in their economic recovery. With U.S. support, the IMF has deployed $40 billion to 19 countries in the region. We've also supported increased assistance by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. In addition, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation recently launched its Health and Prosperity Initiative to mobilize private sector investment in support of global health resilience. The Department coordinated with other government agencies, including DHS and HHS, to protect all persons in U.S. territory from the COVID pandemic. In this regard, sustained cooperation with other countries on the removal of foreign nationals is important. Continuing removal flights during the COVID pandemic has been a challenge for some countries, but it has also helped avoid increasing the numbers of immigrants in ICE detention centers and thus risking more exposure. Out of more than 37,000 ICE removals to Latin America and the Caribbean from March to mid-June, approximately 220 deportees tested positive after removal flights. And I should mention that virtually all of those were for Guatemala for reasons we still don't understand, but still a very small percentage. As to the Western Hemisphere faces this severe health challenge, I want to take this opportunity to discuss a topic of great concern to the United States and to Secretary Pompeo, which you raised, Mr. Chairman. The administration has ongoing concerns about PAHO's involvement in the Mais Médicos program in Brazil, in which doctors were supplied by the Cuban regime for a large amount of money paid not to the doctors but to the regime. On June 23rd, the PAHO Executive Committee approved governance reform measures. It is also, which would avoid something like this happening in the future without the involvement and approval of the Executive Committee. It is also committed to conduct an independent external evaluation of the program. We're hopeful that soon the measures for the independent evaluation will be in place and that will allow us to resume our assessed contributions to PAHO. The combined and complex challenges of the COVID pandemic present a unique opportunity for the United States in confronting the crisis and its economic effects. Despite all that's happened, the United States remains the partner of choice for almost all countries in the region. We will work together to mount a coordinated, cost-effective, disciplined, and comprehensive strategy to recover from the virus and advance prosperity and opportunity in the region. If we succeed, we will have gone a long way toward cementing our strong strategic partnerships in the region with our closest neighbors. And we look forward to working with you in that endeavor and look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. We will then hear from Mr. Josh Hodges, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean. Prior to his current position, Mr. Hodges was a Policy Director in the National Security Council's Western Hemisphere Affairs Directorate. He served previously as a National Security Policy Advisor on the Senate Judiciary Committee and Military Legislative Assistant designee to the Senate Armed Services Committee, as well as Legislative Director in the House of Representatives. Mr. Hodges, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Cyrus, Ranking Member Rooney, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. I'm grateful for the committee's support for the work of USAID, particularly as we address the effects of COVID-19 across Latin America and the Caribbean. We are committed to immediate priority of helping our hemispheric neighbors protect themselves and combat the pandemic and its long-term effects. I want to acknowledge the leadership of President Trump, Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, and Acting Administrator John Barza, as well as our talented teams around the world. I want to also thank Congress and the American people for the critical resources provided to respond to this global crisis. USAID recognizes that to protect our national security priorities and develop efforts in the region, we must begin to look to the future, adapt our processes and structures accordingly, and act. USAID is well positioned to manage a robust and growing response to the threat of COVID-19. Since March, USAID alone has provided more than $105 million to respond to COVID-19, in addition to State Department funds. However, the nature of COVID pandemic, as outlined by the Chairman and Ranking Member, is compounding ongoing challenges, including those that stem from the threat of Chinese exploitation in a region overburdened by the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. These challenges add to the complexity of the COVID-19 pandemic and our response to it. We are deeply concerned about shortages of food and water, estimated to increase as a result of COVID-19. We have seen how malign external actors such as the Communist Party of China are extending alleged assistance that comes with strings attached that don't have the best benefit of the region in mind. As the region suffers an unprecedented economic slowdown, forecasts suggest it could suffer the world's worst increase in joblessness. USAID, as part of the interagency's global All of America response to COVID-19, is rising to the challenge to stand with our international partners. We are addressing the effects of the pandemic in over 30 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. For example, we are strengthening healthcare and providing expert technical assistance, training, capacity building, and life-saving diagnostics and treatment. We are improving clinical care, minimizing the risk of onward transmissions, and helping to prevent and control infections. In addition, we are helping ministries of health provide reliable, verifiable information about how the public can protect themselves and each other. We are sending ventilators to care for the most critically ill patients. And to date, USAID has delivered 950 life-saving, high-quality American-made ventilators to Brazil, Honduras, Peru, El Salvador, and Colombia as of this morning. In addition, we have ongoing shipments to other countries in the region as well. But COVID-19 is not simply a health crisis, and our response cannot just be a health response. We have seen that when we do not address poor governance and conflict, we wipe out investments in health, education, and other basic social services. We are leveraging our development programming to complement our investments in global health. We are pivoting programs and dedicating resources to mitigate the non-health effects of COVID-19 by incentivizing the private sector to mitigate the non-health effects of COVID-19 on rural and urban populations. We're addressing critical needs in social protection, education, water, sanitation, and food security, as well as creating jobs and increasing access to credit, as the ambassador outlined. We are also analyzing and planning for the medium and long-term effects of COVID-19. No other nation can match our unparalleled generosity, our open, collaborative approach, or our long-term commitment to helping countries on their journey to self-reliance. We are also facing the challenge of malign external influence, particularly by the Chinese Communist Party, Iran, and others. Beijing has intervened in sovereign nations' internal affairs to engineer consent for its policies, attaching strings to our neighbors' everyday well-being. Chinese authorities have attempted to extend their influence over discourse and behavior around the world, including in Latin America. This means the United States must tell our story effectively and accurately and identify areas to engage with local communities in their own language. Align our resources for the challenges ahead, including areas of health, governance, energy and infrastructure, investment, digital technology, and others. The COVID-19 situation in Latin America and the Caribbean remains dangerous, as has been outlined, and is likely to exacerbate underlying conditions and ongoing crisis. This is the right thing to do. We will strengthen the regional supply chain, and it is our own domestic national security and prosperity that is also being taken into consideration. I want to thank the committee again, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yield is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. As a reminder to members joining virtually, please turn on your video function so I may not only see you, but also recognize you as we move into questions. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority and alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will start by recognizing myself. The World Health Organization declared on June 1st that Latin America is the new epicenter of the pandemic. Brazil has the second highest number of cases in the world, and Peru, Chile, and Mexico are not far behind. Yet, less than 10% of our foreign assistance for coronavirus response is being provided for Latin America and the Caribbean. And the question is, with Latin America accounting for half of the daily death around the world, Do you believe that the region is being adequately prioritized with only 10% of our assistance is being directed there? Josh?
Yes, sir. I would say that the region is being adequately prioritized, and just to put this into context, in addition to the $105 million, we have redirected additional funds from USAID's ongoing programs to account for the COVID realities that are in place. And if those two figures included, I believe it doubles the amount of COVID-related funding going to the region, and including taking a step back from the funding specifics, sir, with these life-saving ventilators that we're providing to the region. In a global context, there are more ventilators being provided to Latin America and the Caribbean than to anywhere else globally. And so, yes, I do believe that we are adequately prioritizing the region.
How many ventilators you say we're providing?
I'm sorry, sir?
How many ventilators? You say we're
As of today, as I said earlier, we are, by the end of the week, there will be 1,000 there. And that's more than has been delivered globally, regionally.
Is that how many to all the countries in the region
Yes, sir, to date.
as of today?
Yes, sir.
Ambassador, how is the U.S. assisting countries like Brazil, where the outbreak is severe, but President Bolsonaro has refused to take the pandemic seriously?
Well, sir, let me say first that we have been collaborating with Brazil. I think they've received well over $9 million in COVID-related response. Brazil is a little bit like the United States in terms of having portions of the country where the virus has taken hold pretty strongly, particularly in the north and northeast. And then there are other parts where it's actually not been that strong. But also, like the United States, the response in Brazil is largely being governed at the local and provincial or state level. So the type of response that has been adopted in different parts of Brazil is somewhat different, as is the case here. And I should mention that just as you look at this region-wide, you know, nobody's got the magic formula yet for dealing with this disease. So we're being very respectful of the sovereign decisions of different governments. Some people, sometimes the same people, will criticize somebody for being too harsh in applying measures, and then turn around and criticize them for being too lax. We've tried not to engage in that because, you know, we don't have the secret sauce ourselves. The one place we have been critical, though, is countries that are not being serious about reporting and sharing data and being transparent. And that's when I talked about how some of the highest figures of reported infection are in our region. That is true, but that's not necessarily because that's where the highest infection is. It's because some countries are massively underreporting and not being taken to task for that, including in our region, some that you mentioned and Mr. Rooney mentioned. But anyway, the upshot is we've been working collaboratively with Brazil. We've had to, at different times, put measures in effect. We have barred travel from Brazil, routine travel from Brazil. They've banned travel from the United States simply to avoid spreading the disease. That's not, you know, it wasn't done in a spirit of punitiveness or something. It was a cooperative effort to reduce it. And I think probably the proof of how things are going in Brazil, we've got something on the order of 275,000 United States citizens who live in Brazil, who routinely live there. We were initially thinking, boy, we're going to get a flood when they started restricting travel. We've seen very few people leaving, and that's because so far the health systems in Brazil are keeping up with the pandemic. I mean, it's in some areas it's tough. Their ICUs are getting up 75, 80% capacity, but in other parts it's you know, going along in an okay way, and people are not voting with their feet by leaving. So I think that's a sign that, you know, Brazil, while it's got a tough problem, there's no two ways about it, is dealing with it in different ways depending on the part of the country, and you know, we're in it together, and we'll try to come through it together in full collaboration with them.
I see that the Supreme Court ordered the president to wear a mask. We should have that here.
Well, courts have different authorities in different countries, sir.
I will now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Rooney for question.
Chairman, I agree with you about the mask thing. I think lead by example is what leadership's all about. We have problems. Get my note out here. We have, first of all, I would like to ask Mr. Hodges, what are we doing to deal with China's actions in Latin America? I don't trust China a bit, and they'll exploit this to the hilt. And so I'd like to know what we're doing to proactively deal with them and to shore up Taiwan's presence in Latin America.
Thank you, sir. It's a very pertinent question, and we are actively here at USAID working with our state counterparts as well as the rest of the interagency, taking this issue of China and the region very seriously. We have active discussions throughout the region on the reality of why China is approaching with these deals that they come to different countries with, as well as just exposing the truth and the nature of some of those and sort of the debt traps that are behind them, as well as highlighting areas. In some cases, it's as simple as showing them what is happening in other areas of the world, so that the heads of state can see that China does not have the region's best interest at heart. In other cases, we're working with civil society organizations. We're working on a variety of different fronts to really just expose the truth behind the Chinese model. And it really is a factor of, do you want long-term sustainable growth, or do you want something that's going to put your country in debt and sort of be at the mercy of the Chinese? They're also looking to expand very aggressively with digital technology in the region, and I'd be happy to have folks come brief you and your staff on this more thoroughly, but they're aggressively trying to get their technology into the region so that they can sort of push more repressive efforts, as well as just further sort of get their talons into the region.
Are we doing anything to advance recognition of Taiwan? I know we've had a lot of countries abandon Taiwan in the last 10 years.
Sir, this is more in the State Department's lane, so I'll hand it over to Ambassador Kozak. But this is, you're absolutely
Sure.
right, and this is an issue that USAID, I talk regularly to my Taiwanese counterparts.
Yes, thank you.
Ambassador.
9 of the 15 countries that recognize Taiwan are in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we're doing everything we can to keep it that way. I think Taiwan has done a good job. It has the same advantage we do in competing with China, which is, by and large, countries in the region share our values. They're for human rights, they're for democracy, they're for free market competition, and China is the antithesis of all of those things. So we've encouraged Taiwan to be as forward-leaning as possible in the context of the current health pandemic. Taiwan actually had some really good best practices and is exporting them in the region. And I'd say more broadly, as my colleague was just saying about China's influence in the region, people are starting to catch on. You know, it only takes so many times when you realize that China has just loaned some money to your predecessor in government, and now all your oil production for the next 20 years is mortgaged to China, or that there was some hidden fine print and that they're going to take over your major port. So we're saying to countries, sure, trade with China, we trade with China, but do it on your 21st century transparent terms. Don't do it on their 19th century imperialist terms. And be cognizant of the security risks and so on. My deputy has been a real champion on this and has gone around and done not only bilateral diplomacy, but public diplomacy throughout the region to try to bring this out. And I think we've made a real dent. We've seen national governments throughout the region really shying away from these kinds of investments by China that turn into debt traps and so on. And what we're seeing is China is now trying to target like the local and state level officials because they think they can still have fun there, and we're trying to counter it at that level as well. With the current health crisis, yes, China at the outset was able to offer all kinds of PPE and so on because turns out supply chains were such that an awful lot of that was being manufactured in China, and it took us a bit of time to get back in the game. But I would say when you go around the region, sure, people will take a face mask from China if that's what's available. But that doesn't mean that they think China is helping on this. They all know the figures that China has put out on its own experience are completely ridiculous and false. They know that China has not provided information to not only World Health Organization, but any responsible international organizations. They have not provided samples of the early versions of this. They suppressed information that would have likely reduced the spread and the virulence of all of this. So nobody is very happy with China. Yeah, they'll take their face masks and their hand sanitizer, but they're not going to decide that all is forgiven and that China is the champion on this. So it bears, we'll keep working it. We're working it hard. We've got a strategy. We're going to continue to flog it, but we're more than holding our own, I would say.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now recognize Greg Meeks for 5 minutes.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can see you too.
So, you can see me and hear me, good deal. So let me ask this question. You know, on May 20th, I wrote an op-ed titled "A Prescriptive Path Forward for Saving Struggling Countries and Economies." And within that piece, I advocated for globally coordinated stimulus package that provides immediate and much needed aid for countries with the least developed healthcare systems, an urgent stopgap measure to halt the hemorrhaging in emerging markets, and a push for the private sector to reinvest in these developing nations and more sustainably this time, and rebuilding post-COVID in a way that improves prevention capacities and resilience and risk readiness. So I'm going to say to the Deputy Assistant Administrator, I'm heartened to see that USAID is already thinking over the horizon and strategizing about assistance in a post-COVID world. What additional assistance is planned in future fiscal years to ensure our allies and neighbors have ample support as they battle COVID-19 within their borders? And are current U.S. funding levels sufficient given the enormity of the damage inflicted by COVID-19?
Thank you very much for the question, sir. And I'm very happy to be talking about this because it is critical, ongoing work. To the immediate question of future funding, there are ongoing internal deliberative conversations, so we can't get into specific amounts, but I can tell you the USAID and the State Department have had a number of conversations to this end, and USAID is actively working to look over the horizon. We recognize that there's a sense of urgency. We have to address COVID-19 today, but also at the same time be working to get ahead of it, and not just weeks ahead of it and to curb the current trend in the region, but to actually have long-standing sustainable development pathways. And to do that, we've within LAC and with USAID-wide have stood up an over-the-horizon review, and we're meeting regularly to talk about this, to look at the lessons we're learning every day. And just recognizing that we must prepare for lasting changes in order to the development landscape to stay ahead of this, to improve the region so that we'll come out of this stronger with a stronger supply chain to benefit the United States, but also just to ensure that journey to self-reliance. And so we're to the final question about what we need to do differently. We're actively looking at our current programs and operations to see what we need to do differently, and I would very much like to follow up with you on that conversation as this conversation evolves.
Thank you. Let me ask, and many of you know that I've been intricately involved in Colombia, particularly with the plight of African Colombians and the Indo populations. And I've heard repeatedly from those leaders in Choco and the Pacific region that economic and political conditions in the country continue to progress slowly despite the peace plan implementation. In fact, there's been a report that was done by University of Notre Dame Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which talks about how COVID-19 is devastating to them. I suspect that there's similar trends are occurring throughout the region. So my question again is, are African Colombians and indigenous populations in Colombia seeing regressions in economic and political power? And is COVID-19 further compounding the eroding political and economic conditions for African Colombians and indigenous population region-wide? And what is the last USAID and State Department, will you move forward with the substantive COVID-19 response plans? And will all agencies consider the factor and systemic disparities which existed before COVID-19?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Meeks. And you're absolutely right that the effect of this on indigenous and marginalized populations has been even worse than on the population at large throughout the region. That's true in our own country as well. When you start from a lower base, you have less margin for error. So we're quite cognizant of that. We've had programs for years that have been focused on trying to improve the situation of those populations. I think as we look, as my colleague was saying, as we try to retool our existing programs, that's part of what we'll try to do, is to see if we can bring it up. But what I wanted to note on this problem overall is that we're building on a solid base here. We've been very involved and active for decades in this region. That's why we still are the partner of choice. And we have been, even before the COVID outbreak, we've been looking at ways to say, how do we maximize the benefit of what we've been trying to do in the development area? Some of our programs are absolutely critical and I think are effective in the governance area, in trying to build stronger civil society and so on. But what a lot of these countries still suffer from is corruption, lack of transparency, lack of rule of law in their legal systems and so on. And not only is that bad in and of itself, but it discourages investment. And private investment is going to produce much more development than anything that we or other governments can do to bring that about. So this is why we'd started the initiative of America Crece. We started the initiative of that Congress did to the BUILD Act for the DFC. And we see a real opportunity there. We saw it before the COVID crisis to really start bringing investment into the poorest areas of these countries, build out infrastructure, build out energy, so that those parts of the countries can start developing. Yes, it'll have to be tweaked and adjusted because of the COVID crisis has made us start from a lower baseline than we might otherwise have. But I think the fundamentals were in place ahead of time, and we can take advantage of those and really make a difference in the aftermath of this pandemic.
Thank you, Ambassador. Chris Smith. Will now recognize Chris Smith. I will now recognize Ted Yoho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate our witnesses being there, and the input has been great. I want to just commend USAID for the work you guys are doing, along with the DFC. I talked to Adam Bowler, and he said he was tasked at getting 150,000 respirators from the United States domestically and to distribute them. And from what I understand, El Salvador had 50 respirators in their whole country, 50 respirators. We've given them over 500, the way I understand it. And, so the work you guys are doing are good. It's good. We just need to keep doing that. The comment I want to get, or the response I want to get from you, is when we go into this, and we're in the middle of the pandemic, we're going to be looking at food shortages before long. I mean, we already have that now, but with the collapsed economies around the world, what we've seen in our country with our farmers in my state having to plow up their fields because there are no markets, there's going to be a food shortage that I don't think we've seen on this level in a very long time. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that, of what we're doing now to counter that. And then when we go in there with aid, and Ambassador Kosek, I heard you and I appreciate it, and I really appreciate the sentiment that our aid goes to good governance, rule of law, anti-corruption, anti-narcotics. And we've been doing that for probably 20 years, but we don't have it right. And so what happens is China's going to come in there. They don't care about rule of law. They don't care about those things that we try to do that really we know and those countries know is best for them. But China's going to say, here's your money. And as Mr. Hodge brought out, here's your 5G network. And when you have an authoritarian leader in a country that's getting his pockets lined with cash from China, they're going to become more authoritarian and line up with China. And I just want to hear what your response is, how we can do something better or different. And then just briefly touch on Haiti. Haiti has gone through the struggles probably worse than most countries I've ever seen, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Yet today in the 21st century, less than 20% of the people in Haiti have potable water. You can't fight a pandemic if you don't have potable water. And one last thing, I'm sorry to do this, is I've noticed they have cut back in Central and Latin America on the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. There's very strong evidence that says the rubella component of the MMR vaccine is giving some cross protection with COVID. And the research is out there. We'll be happy to send it to you. And if there's anything that we could do to help stimulate any kind of response against the COVID until there's a tangible, safe, effective vaccine, I would have you look at this. We've shared this with the administration, CDC, and all that. So I've thrown you a lot, and if you want to respond to any of that, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I'll take a couple of those questions first. So yeah, in El Salvador, you're correct, sir. Thanks to the generosity of the American people and what we've done there to date, the U.S. government donated ventilators has supported a 200% increase in El Salvador's ICU capacity. And so, and obviously, there's a long way to go to getting ahead of this, but we know the people there are incredibly appreciative. Thanks to these ventilators, they've gone up from 87 ICU beds pre-COVID-19 to 174 ICU beds, and that's according to the Ministry of Health down there. And so we are continuing to move forward on life-saving needs throughout the region, and very, very proud of the work that our teams are doing, and it's tireless work, but very, very happy to see things continue to move. Related to the ag industry question that you raised, I'll touch on that just very briefly. We've engaged USAID for our part, and I don't want to take too much of the time from the ambassador here, but we've engaged with the Department of Commerce to make sure that our programs that we are funding and putting in place related to COVID-19 to keep things moving in the region has a connection back here so that everything's sort of working together in a strategic way. But with that, oh yes, on vaccines, we continue to work on vaccine through Gavi, and USAID already playing a key role in research and development and future production for availability of future vaccines.
Okay, and I might add to that on the questions about China and Haiti. Look, on China, I mentioned the good governance and so on. That is a necessary but not sufficient component of development, and we've seen that in a number of countries where we've run good programs on that front, but we haven't made a dent in the development of those countries. And we think that's in part because the climate for investment remains so poor. But I'll give you some examples that I think people are seeing around the region. Costa Rica had the Chinese come in and build a sports stadium in the capital. Great, looks nice. They have a soccer stadium. The thing has all kinds of structural defects. They were telling me there's no instruction book. Everything's in Chinese, so the electrical workers and so on can't figure out the wiring diagrams. And it's not turning out to be that good a deal for them. On the other hand, Panama, right next door, through U.S. investment, they have $1.5 billion new liquefied natural gas terminal there, and it become the hub for the region. That's going to produce real economic growth throughout the region, and it's a real investment. It's not a bauble. Right. El Salvador was telling us the Chinese came in and they had a deal where they were going to help them develop a port. But when the Salvadorans started looking at the fine print, the Chinese were in a position where they could call the loan, a couple years after it was made, and then take over the port. And in addition, they found that China was going around and was trying to buy up 73% of the coastline of El Salvador. So they said, we almost became prisoners of the Chinese Communist Party in our own country. So this is the kind of stuff we're trying to push out there. Even if you're a democratically elected leader with authoritarian tendencies, if you've got the independent parliament, you've got independent journalists and so on watching this, it's going to be hard to get away with that kind of an investment.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now recognize
Thank you.
Joaquin Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for your testimony today. It's our understanding that Mexican President López Obrador will be visiting Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump soon to discuss the USMCA. However, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is not scheduled to meet with them. Given the rising number of cases of COVID-19 in Mexico, which you've described, and the United States, which we're all experiencing, do you believe it's wise for the presidents to meet during a global pandemic that's affecting their countries with some of the greatest number of cases?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Castro. Well, today is the entry into force of USMCA, so it's a very important day. We think that, talk about developing economies in the region, this is really going to increase the powerhouse of the three countries in North America, and so it's something very worth noting and trying to advance implementation of. In terms of response to the virus, U.S., Canada, and Mexico have worked very, very closely together. We've had coordination at the head of government level, but we've had weekly coordination. My colleague, Deputy Secretary Began, has worked with his counterparts. So there's been, when you look at border restrictions on U.S., Canada, Mexico, those have all been coordinated amongst the three countries. So we've tried to find the right balance between keeping commerce going amongst the countries and at the same time cutting back on non-essential travel. So as to...
Well, Secretary Kozak, let me ask you, do you have any idea why Prime Minister Trudeau was not invited, if this is to celebrate USMCA?
I haven't seen the announcement the White House has put out yet, but there's been a desire for some time for a bilateral agreement between the Mexican president and our president. It'll be the Mexican President López Obrador's first trip abroad as president of Mexico. We have lots of contact with Canada. I would stay tuned on that. We're in daily touch and very high-level touch with Canada on a whole range of issues, including trade issues. So I wouldn't draw conclusions that because a week after USMCA comes into effect, the two presidents are meeting, that's somehow an exclusion of Canada.
Okay, let me ask you all, during the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen several Latin American governments take on authoritarian positions and spread false information to their own people. For example, El Salvador's government has detained their citizens for violating their stay-at-home order and forcing them to stay in quarantine centers. On the other hand, President Bolsonaro of Brazil continues to downplay the statistics and danger of the virus, putting Brazilians in danger. What actions has the State Department and USAID taken to discourage these displays of anti-democratic rule and the spread of misinformation?
Well, as I mentioned before, Mr. Castro, we have tried to be a little bit cautious about telling other countries how to deal with the pandemic. We haven't found the magic formula yet for getting the right balance between, stay-at-home orders and recovering the economy. As I mentioned with Brazil, it's very much like our country, a federal arrangement where the power tends to be vested in local and state authorities anyway, and you see different reactions all around Brazil and different results. In El Salvador, we've seen some steps there that were pretty tough, but we've seen those in cities in the United States as well. So we haven't wanted to put on our bossy pants about what you should be doing about COVID. At the same time, we do defend, people's right to express themselves and that kind of thing, and have said so when that has been affected in other countries. But it's where we have drawn the line, though, is there's some countries where what they're reporting is simply, we know that they're cooking the books in terms of reporting on the disease, not only to their own people, but to regional and World Health authorities, and that compounds the problem. So there we've been a little more prescriptive.
I yield back, Jim.
Thank you. John Curtis, is he on? Kent Buck? Michael Guest?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being here today. Mr. Hodges, I had the opportunity last week to speak with Administrator Bartz on some of the same topics that we are discussing here today. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Hodges, you say on page 3 of your written testimony there on the top paragraph, you talk about challenges that add to the complexity of COVID-19. Of course, we talk about the shortages of food and water. We talk about the uptick of violence against women and minorities. But then the third thing in that paragraph, and you touched on this briefly earlier, as external actors, as the Communist Party of China are using others' suffering as an excuse to extend assistance, and you put assistance in parentheses, that comes with unsustainable debt and other strings that only pull countries further away from the goal of self-reliance. And could you expand on that just briefly and give some specific examples of what China is doing in the line of the predatory assistance in response to COVID-19 and how they are using this along with what they've been using for some period of time, their Belt and Road Initiative, to gain influence in Latin America and South America?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. So for one specific example, in 2017 alone, China extended more than $6.8 billion in non-concessional loans to the LAC region. And as we know, Chinese loans come with strings attached that do not allow countries to progress, as in the testimony on this journey to self-reliance. And so what we see is China, and we see this globally really, is that China comes in, they come, as the ambassador outlined earlier, in El Salvador. They try sort of a myriad of different approaches to take control of different, whether it's ports, whether it's just critical infrastructure, so that they're the ones that own those resources that should belong to the, in this case, the El Salvadoran people, but the region, basically to the region, and instead China winds up being the de facto owner of those just due to the balance of debt. And so, and I'd be happy to follow up with you and your staff with some more sort of concrete examples of that. But sort of that's the big scope of it, sir, is that they really provide what looks like a good deal to these countries that are in need for investment. But when you really dig down into the details of it, it winds up putting the country in a disincentive on the long term. And just to put this into context, in 2017, the U.S. official development assistance was nearly $2 billion to the region, while China's was around $400 million. That U.S. figure doesn't include FDI or U.S. remittances back to the region. And if you combine all of that together, the amount that the United States and the people of the United States and people who come here from other countries from the region provide back to the region for economic benefit dwarfs what China is offering to them. And our offer comes with the good faith effort of, we want you to succeed. We want a strong region. We want a prosperous region.
And is Congress providing you and your agency with the tools you need to counteract what China is doing in that region as it relates to assistance to developing countries?
Sir, I would defer to Ambassador Kozak on sort of this more diplomacy question, but USAID appreciates everything Congress has been providing us to date. And as I said earlier, as we look over the horizon on this, I would welcome the opportunity to come back and speak with you on this.
Mr. Ambassador, is Congress providing you the tools that you need to combat what we're seeing China's attempt to grow their influence in these countries?
Yes, Congressman, I would say Congress is, but with the notion that we're not going to compete with China sort of dollar for dollar on their terms, because we're not going to do rotten loans and the kind of thing that my colleague was just describing. So we're trying to put it in other areas. I think some of the tools Congress has given us recently, particularly the DFC, is a really giant leap forward in this. There's some complications in it that it is limited. We can't use it in all the countries in the region because of income level restrictions and that kind of thing. But those kinds of efforts are really huge. Anything that allows us to leverage private investment, because if we can spend $100 million of taxpayer money and get $1 billion of private investment, that's a whole lot bigger impact than just the $100 million. And it really is a force multiplier in dealing with China, where we really do already outstrip them. But the other part has been public diplomacy efforts, and I think we've been able to do that effectively. We might be able to use some help from Congress, just as members travel and so on, reminding everybody what you get into if you go down the wrong path with China.
Thank you, Ambassador. I don't think too many people are going to be traveling in the next 6 months. We have votes, so we're going to try to keep this within the time. Adriano Espaillat is recognized for 5 minutes. Dean Phillips, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our two witnesses. Earlier this month, a prominent Mexican labor lawyer, Susana Prieto, was arrested on trumped-up charges and subsequently denied bail in retaliation for her labor advocacy, which comes on the eve of the implementation of the USMCA, in which ensuring Mexican labor standards is clearly a vital component. When asked about Ms. Prieto's arrest in a Ways and Means Committee hearing, U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer shared that he believed that Prieto's arrest was a bad indicator, quote, bad indicator of Mexico's commitment to labor reform. As Mexican President Obrador is set to visit Washington, of course, this month, I urge President Trump and Secretary Pompeo to raise that matter and stress its importance to the United States. My first question is directed to you, Mr. Ambassador. I trust that you believe that heads of state should respect the separation of powers and the constitutional roles of each branch of government. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
I'm glad to hear that. So I have a series of questions about El Salvador, where President Bukele continues to undermine democratic institutions. Do you believe it was appropriate for him to send El Salvador's armed forces to the National Assembly after lawmakers refused to give him the funding that he had asked for?
No, and we said so at the time.
Yeah, I presume it's not the right approach to civil-military relations, of course. My second question is relative again to the National Assembly, which passed legislation twice that did not give the president the authority that he wanted. Both times, President Bukele put in place executive orders undermining the Assembly and granting himself those powers. Also, both times, the country's constitutional court ruled that President Bukele was in violation of the Constitution. Most egregiously, both times, the president went ahead with his executive orders anyway. I presume you feel it was not appropriate for the president to disregard the will of the National Assembly and the Constitutional Court. Is that fair?
It's not to, yes, not to disregard the authorities of the court, but I would say this part of the dispute within El Salvador, there's an argument over what powers the president has constitutionally in an emergency, whether he needs enabling legislation from the legislature or not. The three branches are having a robust argument about that. We have tried to urge them all to be respectful of each other and to try to come to some accommodation on a practical way forward. But it's on the theoretical or constitutional level of who has the inherent authority to do one thing or another and what limitations it's subject to. You know, we're trying to see them do a orderly, good faith process, but it's a little bit of political question doctrine too. So we've been reluctant to jump into the middle of the legal debate. As distinct from when you bring troops into a legislature, that's not a legal debate anymore. And in that case, I must say the president ended up deferring to the court that he shouldn't have done that.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, you might recall in an April 24th press briefing, you were asked about President Bukele's actions on democratic actions. Your comment was, quote, he's got extremely high popularity ratings so far for his handling of the crisis, end quote. I trust you don't believe that his popularity should make him exempt from respecting democratic norms. Is that fair to say?
That is correct, and that was not the intent of my answer. I think that was a longer answer, and one of the other questions had been whether the measures he was taking were too draconian, and I was pointing to his the approval ratings of the population for the measures to say apparently they didn't find them to be draconian, but that certainly would not be an excuse or a reason for violating a constitutional separation of powers.
I appreciate that. And lastly, relative to El Salvador, while the Trump administration, has been vocal about the disastrous public health responses in both Venezuela and Nicaragua, it has really been silent about power grabs in El Salvador and Bolivia. So do you believe that the State Department's inconsistency in calling out these governments undermines our interests by feeding into the perception, at least, that our criticisms on human rights grounds are informed by ideology rather than democratic principles?
Sir, I believe our criticisms with respect to both Venezuela and Nicaragua have been a systematic effort to cover up what is going on the medical front, reporting false information, not only to their own populations, but to medical authorities and so on. That's distinct from the legal issues of whether one branch of government has a certain amount of authority over it or not. This is kind of unprecedented areas. But that's why I was saying we have been critical of countries that are falsifying data, basically. We've been much more willing to cut some slack to countries that are struggling to get it right on what's the right balance between shutdowns and opening up your economy and that kind of thing. It's the same kind of issues that we're struggling with at home, and we don't want to try to usurp that decision.
Thank you, Ambassador. And 11?
Yeah, my time is up. Thank you.
The chair recognizes end 11.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. Ambassador Kozak, you have a long career of service focused on the Western Hemisphere and human rights. So I know you're aware of the human rights abuses that the Haitian people have endured. I'm committed as a member of Congress and a longtime human rights defender, including in Haiti, to fight for Haitian human rights. And I'm extremely worried that this administration's policies have done the opposite, especially when it comes to COVID-19. The State Department issued a do not travel advisory for Haiti on March 5th. That's the highest level travel advisory state can issue. And this was weeks before the department put out a global travel advisory because of COVID-19. The Haiti advisory warns emergency response, including ambulance service, is limited or non-existent. That's a quote. To me, that says that the department understood that Haiti's healthcare infrastructure was incredibly weak. Yet just 1 month later, on April 7th, our country began to deport Haitians despite the pandemic and the knowledge that Haiti was not equipped to contain it. And the U.S. has continued these deportations even after a number of Haitians arrived in Haiti, were tested, and were positive for COVID-19. So my first question is this: we know COVID-19 has devastated even the best healthcare systems. We know Haiti can't handle it. We know how quickly this virus jumps borders. So even if we control the virus in the United States, if it takes hold in Haiti, our whole region remains at risk. Are you confident, sir, that Haiti can respond possibly to a sizable outbreak of COVID-19?
Well, on the latter point, there's no doubt, your premise of your question is quite right, that the Haitian infrastructure in this area is very weak, as it is in many areas of their society and culture.
Okay, yeah, in many countries. And how many people has the United States deported to Haiti who've tested positive for COVID-19?
It's been a handful. Let me mention, though, the policy on that, so that there's some understanding of why we're doing it and how we're doing it. And I've had this conversation with all of the most senior officials in the Haitian government as well. The U.S. has continued, as I said in my testimony, removals, people with final orders of removal from the United States, because we didn't want to start having people pile up in ICE detention facilities once they've got their final orders of removal. If you do that, you're creating a congregate setting in which the spread of disease is at some risk. So the calculation has been that it's much better for people to be home with their families.
Reclaim my time. Sir, I have limited time. I want to reclaim it. I don't think it's credible for this administration to say it's concerned about people piling up in ICE detention facilities when we continue to detain scores and hundreds of people who have nothing but a civil infraction in ICE facilities. And the danger of COVID spread in them is incredible. So the small number of people who you might deport to Haiti or whatnot is a tiny fraction of that problem. I want to know what U.S. policy is advanced by deporting COVID positive people to Haiti, as we have done. I believe it's at least 8 people and maybe more.
Congressman, the total number of COVID positive or people who have been deported and later have shown up as COVID positive is 220 out of 37,000. Of those, I think 186 were Guatemalan. We're still trying to figure out why the numbers are so high there. So it's a very small percentage, and if you exclude Guatemala, it's a super small percentage. The reason it's small is that the policy of ICE, and they would be able to go into it in more detail, they do not put anybody on a removal flight who they have any indication has a contagious disease or is sick in any way. They wait for them to recover before they take them out. The reason you get a handful where they turn up positive at the other end is that with this disease, you can test positive or test negative in the morning and test positive in the afternoon. So there has been a conscious effort. They've improved their protocols all along. We work with the other countries to put in place good, sound protocols. It's been a very good cooperative effort. But the bottom line is getting people back home to their families, out in their communities, away from being in a congregate setting is better for them. The leaders of those countries recognize that as well.
Okay, sir,
they've worked with us.
Sir, the idea that deporting people is sending them back to their families is an absurd statement, with all due respect. Many people we're deporting haven't been in those countries in many years. Let me just ask you one other question, because my time is limited. I know AMLO is visiting President Trump next week. Will President Trump bring up with AMLO the unconscionable and unacceptable detention of the labor activist and attorney Susana Prieto? Will he bring that up with AMLO? Yes or no? Or will you encourage him to?
I can't tell you what the president will do until he does it, but I can say that her case is very familiar to us. We are in close touch with her through her family, and are tracking it very closely. And as Ambassador Lighthizer said, we see this as a very bad development. I think the Mexican government knows that. And
Secretary Kozak, I'm going to have to thank you, Representative Levin. Going to have to go on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Absolutely. It should be noted, though, I was at 2 ICE detention centers in the last few weeks, and they don't test everybody who was there, just to make that clear. Let me go on to Vicente Gonzalez of Texas. Vicente, are you around? How about Representative Vargas?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing, Mr. Cyrus, and thank you, Ambassador and Director, for being here. I do want to follow up with some of the questions of the deportations. In particular, on March 20th, 2020, CDC issued an order using COVID-19 as a pretext to circumvent the asylum process and humanitarian protections for unaccompanied children and others. The order was extended indefinitely in May. Since the order went into effect, you've said 37,000 people have been deported, but I believe it's 43,000 people have been automatically expelled without due process, including 2,175 unaccompanied children. The majority are being pushed into Mexico. Children are being deported into crowded deportation flights into their home countries. Title 42 proceedings, the Public Health Authority claims to give authority to automatically expel asylum seekers and children without due process. The provision was never meant to regulate immigration, and I think is being grossly misused. And we do know that some of these people that have been deported, as you just stated, 220 have COVID-19, but not all of them are tested. So I'd like to ask you, how is that in any way humane, and how are we doing the right thing, especially when we're trying to show the world, and especially Latin America, that we're not China?
thank you, sir. And you're right. I was talking about 37,000 coming out of ICE detention facilities, as opposed to people who are encountered at the border and turned around pursuant to the Title 42 order of CDC. And I think the numbers you cited are the right ones for that. I would note for those people, again the rationale, as I understand it, behind CDC's order was to avoid large numbers of people congregating at the border control points, ports of entry, and the result is that the people who are turning back, I think in the 95, 96% of them are going back into Mexico within 90 minutes to 2 hours of arriving at the port of entry. So it's a very different deal. In one case, you have people who've been held in detention for some time. In the other, you have people who show up and you're saying, wait, don't come in now, we're not open for business. And so that's the distinction.
But with the rapid, you stated, and I believe the chairman also stated, that the epicenter of the coronavirus is in Latin America. Don't you think it's unconscionable that we just send these people back, not knowing exactly their situation in the country, especially the children? How is that in any way humane or the right thing to do?
Well, again, I would refer you to the health authorities, but I would observe that the country with the most infections is the United States. So they're coming from countries with lower infections into the, if we let them into the United States, then, you know, you have a risk here as well. So, you know, you have to, I would have to refer you back to colleagues at CDC as to all the rationale that went into the decision-making on this. We're involved in the diplomatic part of it, not the operational part, but in trying to work with other governments to be sure we're coordinated and aligned on this. And I must say, in that, we've had extremely good professional cooperation across the board. There's been a willingness. Everybody realizes that this is a extremely difficult humanitarian situation and has worked with it, with us and very effectively to try to deal with it.
Well, I guess, again, I do want to thank you for your service. I know you've had a long and distinguished service, but frankly, I think that the nations down there see what, especially the people there, see exactly what we're doing, is we're not giving the immigrants that come here an opportunity to go through a due process procedure where they're asking for asylum. Instead, we're simply throwing them back into their countries in a situation that's very difficult without giving them any opportunity to prove their case. And I don't think it's a good situation, especially when we are trying to combat what is happening in Latin America vis-a-vis the Chinese, who I think are giving the Latin Americans a very raw deal.
Well, sir, I would observe one thing that we are avoiding, which is the human smugglers. They are really adept at finding every time we change a procedure, every time we do something, they immediately shift around and try to victimize people who would fit the category they think they can smuggle into the U.S. And frankly, that is one of the biggest dangers. If you start getting large numbers of people coming out of Central America in caravans, going in the back of trucks through the desert and everything again, that is certainly not going to be healthy for them either. I would like to put some emphasis on some of the things we are trying to do to deal with protection concerns of people in the region. Now, it's not that people don't have legitimate concerns in some of these places. But one of the little-known things we've been doing for some years now is working with the UN authorities. There's a system called the Protection Transfer Arrangements in the three Central American countries. And if people have protection concerns there, saying, I'm being persecuted for political, religious, social reasons, they can go to UNHCR, they can get their case adjudicated, and if it's found meritorious, they will try to place them. A great percentage of the people who have been found meritorious that way have been placed in the United States, but they're coming here in a safe, orderly, legal way and not showing up at the border in the hands of human smugglers. So this is what we're trying to do, is channel that demand into a channel that is safe, orderly, legal, and isn't being abused and subjecting a lot of people to abuse by smugglers.
I think my time has expired. I certainly would have challenged you on that. But again, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Vicente Gonzalez, recognized for 5 minutes. Closing statements. Where's our closing statements? Well, this has been a very interesting hearing, not only in the process, but all the good information that we received. Thank you again for being here and for joining us, whether virtually or in person, for this important hearing. This virus has taken nearly 130,000 lives in our country and another 100,000 lives in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the face of this devastation, we must come together to work with our southern neighbors to bring the coronavirus under control. I thank our witnesses and the members for their participation. I look forward to working with my colleagues in Congress and the administration to support the public health response and economic recovery in the region. And with that, the committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, sir.